Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure of the Environment and Public Works Committee will come to order. Let me acknowledge that this is our first hearing for the subcommittee in this Congress, and I want to thank specifically Senator Carper and Senator Capito, our chair and ranking member of the full committee, for their support of our subcommittee in the work that we are doing and allowing us to conduct this hearing today. I want to thank Senator Kramer and his staff for helping us put together today's hearing, and I look forward to working with Senator Kramer and other members of this subcommittee as we take on the important work of this Congress in regards to infrastructure. We will have a unique opportunity to act on a 5 or 6 year surface transportation reauthorization bill, and that allows us to take up not only the funding level, but many of the issues concerning infrastructure in America. And we could talk about many issues from multimodal capacities to adequate maintenance to adaptation and climate issues. So there's certainly a lot of issues that need to be talked about as we look at the reauthorization bill. Today's hearing will deal with equity in transportation infrastructure, connecting communities, removing barriers, repairing networks across America. So this is obviously a very important subject and one in which I welcome today's witnesses to help us in our discussion. The building of our national highway system from the 1950s was in many ways a great national achievement, a major public investment in our infrastructure that transformed our country and that we continue to rely on today. But for far too many communities, especially, now we have light, especially communities of color, ethnic communities, and urban centers, the construction of our highways had traumatic and destructive impacts. Rather than connecting their communities and expanding their opportunities, highway construction brought demolition, displacement, isolation, and exclusion. The siting of highways was sometimes done under the banner of seemingly noble goals of urban renewal and removing blight, but sometimes also with overtly racist intentions of cutting off and segregating. In reality, it destroyed thriving communities, homes, and businesses, and tore apart social networks. These highway projects often made it more difficult for people in these communities to reestablish stable livelihoods, achieve personal and economic progress, and build wealth in the decades that followed. The city of Baltimore is intimately familiar with this painful history of highway planning and highway building. It has experienced it firsthand. It lives with the legacy today. African Americans in Baltimore were disproportionately affected between 1951 and 1964. About 90% of all housing displacements occurred in Baltimore's black neighborhoods. There were many plans for numerous highways to be built in Baltimore City. The city would have lost some of its neighborhoods that are now cherished, an integral part of our city. The Inner Harbor would have been devastated by a John Highway interchange. All of this would have happened to much a greater extent if it was not for a coalition of advocates who raised their voices in opposition to these plans. Among those voices was my friend and former Senate colleague Barbara Mikulski, who is known to have entered politics through the fight over highways through her involvement in the movement against destruction. These advocates and community leaders were able to save 28,000 housing units from demolition, mostly in minority and ethnic communities, which is Baltimore's strength. But they were not able to save all neighborhoods from the bulldozers. Part of the highway plan for Baltimore was to have an east-west corridor connecting I-70 coming in from the west to downtown Baltimore. It was meant to facilitate commuting by car from the suburbs, in the eyes of some like Robert Moses, to clear out what they saw as slums. This east-west highway was never completed, but it still did damage. And African Americans were disproportionately impacted, with 3,000 residents, mostly black, uprooted in the late 1960s to make way for this highway that was never completed. Today, this highway to nowhere is a barrier, an impediment, a source of pollution, not convenience. Occupying a 30-foot trench, this massive roadway in the Franklin-Marbury corridor in West Baltimore separates and isolates neighborhoods such as Harlem Park from other parts of the city. This is the legacy of infrastructure that is felt in cities across the country and that we must now reckon with today. By removing barriers that are no longer useful, we can help reconnect communities to opportunities, improve their health and safety, and make daily life better. I am proud to join Senator Carper, our chair, in supporting the Reconnecting Communities Act, a bill that would establish federal programs to support the planning and implementation of projects to remove infrastructure barriers, such as the Mulberry-Franklin corridor in Baltimore City, barriers that have clearly outlived their usefulness but remain a burden to our neighborhoods. Let me quote from my former colleague and dear friend, the late Congressman John Lewis, when he told us, and I quote, "The legacy of Jim Crow transportation is still with us. Even today, some of our transportation policies and practices destroy stable neighborhoods, isolate and segregate our citizens in deteriorating neighborhoods, and fail to provide access to jobs and economic growth centers," end quote. A report in the New York Times last year highlighted how the urban heat island effect disproportionately impacts communities that were redlined. These communities can be 5 to 12 degrees hotter on summer days in areas in the same city that enjoy more favorable housing policies. The article described a mother with 2 young kids trekking more than a mile on foot just to get to a park with some shade. Our past highway investments have left too many Americans in low-income communities to navigate acres of asphalt and cross lanes of roads that serve only fast-moving vehicle traffic just to take care of their daily needs, to buy groceries, to get their kids to child care, or to connect to transit to get to work. For too many Americans, transportation infrastructure has created stressful, unsafe, and unhealthy conditions, and that is why we must build back better. We also see inequity in the data that suggests that communities of color disproportionately bear the burden of pollution and health and safety risks from transportation. In the most recent Dangerous by Design report, Smart Growth America found that between 2010 and 2019, Black Americans were struck and killed by drivers at an 82% higher rate than white non-Hispanic Americans. We know that investing in transit is a key part of addressing inequity in transportation. And in Maryland, we have a lot of work to do to expand and upgrade our transit system. But our roads and streets and related safety policies also play a critical role. And because this committee has specific jurisdiction over our highway program, our focus today is on how we can improve this area of our transportation policy to address equity. I am proud to author the Transportation Alternative Program, a critical component of our surface transportation programs. This program ensures that a segment of our federal transportation funding supports the priorities of local communities for carrying out projects such as bike lanes, pedestrian infrastructure, and safety improvements. TAP funds were used in Baltimore in regards to the Lincoln pathway that reconnects communities that were not connected together so that people can really enjoy their neighborhoods. We need to do more to build on the Transportation Alternative Program and give more opportunities for cities and local communities to guide resources that they need. I applaud President Biden for making transportation equity a centerpiece of the American Jobs Plan for investing in our nation's infrastructure. This plan calls for us to address our legacy of past infrastructure projects, and it calls for 40% of the benefits of our climate and clean infrastructure investments to go to disadvantaged communities. In addition, he signed on January 20th an executive order on advancing racial equality and support for underserved communities through federal government. This executive order calls on the federal government agencies to assess whether underserved communities and their members face systemic barriers to accessing benefits and opportunities available pursuant to the policies and programs. This is a step that is critical for our transportation. Poor transportation infrastructure has limited the opportunities for disadvantaged communities, creating and perpetuating inequity, contributing to poverty, poor health, low employment, and poor and insufficient housing conditions. In contrast, good transportation infrastructure provides an opportunity to enhance the lives of many and to help sustain their communities. That should be our goal as we look at the Transportation Reauthorization Act. With that, I recognize my distinguished ranking member, Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Chairman Cardin. Thanks for holding this important hearing. I was thinking as you were started your comments that if Carper, Capito, Cardin, and Kramer can't solve this problem, nobody in the alphabet can. One of the things I've appreciated most about serving on the Environment and Public Works Committee is the bipartisan consensus we strive to achieve and often do we often do. It's not very sexy, but we often strive for and achieve consensus. And on a personal note, I've especially enjoyed working with you on legislation to support things like clean nuclear energy, refining our PPP forgiveness process to better serve both lenders and borrowers. And I wanted to serve as a ranking member on this subcommittee to further the cooperation that has historically driven infrastructure policy really over the years and the decades. It's my hope that we can continue the trend by crafting a reauthorization bill that meets the priorities of North Dakotans and Marylanders alike. And despite our geographic and political differences, all of our constituents understand the importance of roads, bridges, and waterways and the role they play in fostering economic development and interstate commerce. No doubt, many of North Dakota's agricultural products make it into Annapolis restaurants, or they are shipped out of the port of Baltimore, and that benefits both states and everyone in between. My point being, of course, if we keep the main thing, I believe we have a route to success on this reauthorization. That brings us to today's hearing, equity in transportation infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, one of the aspects I appreciate most about EPW is the statutes under our jurisdiction reinforce federalism. Highway policies and projects are coordinated between the state and federal government rather than dictated from the federal government to the states. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I appreciated your comments during our last hearing on the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. When you had an exchange with a witness regarding how a VMT would fit within a federalist model, it was a great point on your part, and it highlights how we are all very cognizant of the state's role in this equation. Typically, infrastructure projects start from the grassroots, work their way up to the state, and then the federal level. That's why this committee, along with AASHTO and State Department of Transportation officials, which I'm glad to see we have two here today, have consistently supported distributing federal dollars via formula so every state can be responsive to both the interstate commerce needs within their borders and community connectivity issues. My point being, there are multiple examples of poor planning decisions that have led to adverse consequences for specific communities. None of us deny that. And I think we all agree they should be rectified. I believe it should be done at the local and state level where decision makers are closest to the people and able to make a balanced decision. If a new route, expansion, or removal is necessary, that should be done through the state planning process with the formula dollars allotted to them, not a new discretionary grant that pulls from the limited pool of funding within the Highway Trust Fund. That being said, Mr. Chairman, I've always advocated for going big in this infrastructure package. Last Congress, we all supported the passage of the largest highway bill in history, and I have no problem breaking that record again this time around. However, the current proposal to deal with the issue at hand, the Reconnecting Communities Act, introduced by Chairman Carper, would take $15 billion out of the Highway Trust Fund to establish a new discretionary grant. And I don't object to $15 billion being added to an infrastructure package, but how it's dispersed is key. As you all know, the current formula versus discretionary split is roughly 90% formula to 10% discretionary. That is the policy today, and retaining it is one of the top requests from AASHTO and many members of this committee, including me. If we were to pass the Reconnecting Communities Act while following the current 90 to 10 distribution, it would require $135 billion be added to the formula side of the ledger. Similarly, rather than creating a new discretionary grant, if we were to distribute the proposed $15 billion via traditional formula, we would not be picking winners and losers among states. Rather, this would allow each of them the flexibility to be responsive to their communities. If we went this route, it equates to roughly $95 million to North Dakota and millions, if not billions, in the case of California, more for every other state in the Union. It goes without saying, but federal highways exist for interstate commerce. Planning decisions to reroute or remove portions of the system should not be made lightly and should take into account every interested party and the potential repercussions or even unintended consequences of those actions. Again, I would reiterate, the state is best equipped to manage these requests, not a federal bureaucrat parsing through grant applications, determining which applicant meets the political objectives of whoever is in charge. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, the most prominent examples I have seen are in urban settings, as you described. But if you put the issue equity in a rural context, those communities are not struggling with obtrusive infrastructure that gets in the way. Rather, they're dealing with a lack of infrastructure connectivity. H.R. 2 and the Reconnecting Communities Act both limit new capacity or new miles being added to the system, effectively shutting out rural and tribal communities who need more new access, not less. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I look forward to discussing these issues and listening to the witnesses before us.
Senator Kramer, thank you for those comments, particularly our ability to find a way to work together, which has been the history of the Environment and Public Works Committee. I agree with you completely. Just as a way of background, I served 20 years in the state legislature, 8 years as Speaker, and served on President Reagan's Federalism Task Force. So I share your strong belief that decisions made at the local level on transportation are certainly the best decisions. We do have interstate and national priorities, but we very much have to protect the ability of local communities to make those decisions. So thank you very much for your comments, and I look forward to working with you. All four of our witnesses today are very distinguished. They're appearing before this committee virtually. They're not here in person. So we will try to use the technology the best that we possibly can. And most of the members that are going to be participating on this committee will also be doing it virtually. So I hope that we all can bear with the technology. Let me introduce two of our witnesses, then I'll recognize Senator Kramer to introduce the two other witnesses that we have on the panel today. Tokes Omishakin is the director of the California Department of Transportation. We have a director, a state director, which I think can give us some very important information. But the director also has on his resume, he's a graduate from the University of Maryland College Park, which to me shows good sense on his undergraduate degree. Also, founder of a planning consulting firm in the D.C. area, so knows the D.C. area very, very well. Veronica Davis is the Director of the Transportation and Drainage Operations, City of Houston. We welcome her to the committee to give us the perspective from Houston. She also served in the Nashville transportation, so has a broad experience in local government and understands the multimodal challenges that we have. Now let me recognize Senator Kramer to introduce the last two witnesses, and then we'll turn it over to Director Omishakin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Dr. Stephen Paulson is with us today, and he completed his appointment as a Senior Advisor for Research and Technology in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the Department of Transportation in early 21. And previous to that, he served as Director of Mobility Policy Research at the Center for Urban Transportation Research, University of South Florida. Prior positions included working for transit agencies in Chicago, Cleveland, and Dallas, and has experience in the frontline agencies involved in carrying out and complementing transportation services, and has served on the Board of Directors for Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Authority and on the Hillsborough County Metropolitan Planning Organization Board. His professional interests include transportation policy, imagine that, travel behavior and travel demand, transportation system performance, travel data analysis, transportation decision-making, and public transportation. In July of this year, Dr. Paulson will assume a position of Research Professor, Tomnet University Transportation Center, School of Sustainable Engineering in the Built Environment, Arizona State University in Tempe. Dr. Paulson is a civil engineer with a BSCE from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and master's and PhD degrees in civil engineering with a focus on transportation from Northwestern University. And I look forward to learning from his federal and academic experience. Bill Panos is my friend and the North Dakota Director of Transportation, and formerly served in the same role for Wyoming. So probably Senator Lummis could introduce him even better than me. I would also note that while Bill is with the North Dakota Department of Transportation, his testimony has been agreed to and is on behalf of 5 rural states, including North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. So welcome, Bill, and thanks to you for sharing your expertise with the committee today. And since coming to North Dakota, Bill has been a breath of fresh air, providing excellent advice and help to me and to my team. I've had the pleasure of bringing multiple North Dakota witnesses to EPW, and I've been looking forward to getting Bill's expertise before EPW, and look forward to his expertise.
Thank you for those introductions. For all 4 of our witnesses, your entire statements will be made part of our record. So they are included in the record. We'd ask that you summarize your testimony in approximately 5 minutes, leaving time for questions by members of the committee. We will start with Director Shakin.
Good morning, Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Kramer, and members of the committee. I am Tokes Omashakin, Director of the California Department of Transportation, also known as Caltrans, the largest state department of transportation in the nation. I'm honored to be with you remotely and part of today's important conversation. Equity and transportation have long been intertwined. Transportation is a critical and deciding issue as it determines whether or not people have access to work and to essential goods and services. Transportation policies and spending programs do not benefit all populations equally. Historically, transportation policies have also prioritized highway development, some of which were built by dividing minority and low-income populations. These and other transportation policies have had inequitable outcomes. This approach has also been enshrined in our funding decisions, in which a focus of transportation dollars has been on expanding roads. This needs to shift in a way that transportation is truly built back better for all. Low-income families and people of color, people who are less likely than the average Californian to have access to a personal automobile, have been left behind by our investments in infrastructure. Limiting access to jobs and economic opportunities, social and educational opportunities, healthcare services, places of worship, and other important destinations, such as even the grocery store. Further, the burdens of poor road conditions are disproportionately shouldered by communities marginalized by transportation infrastructure. Overall, minority and underserved communities experience fewer benefits and take on a greater share of negative impacts associated with our transportation systems. Because of this, transportation equity is not just a transportation issue. To improve equity across the board, we must address transportation in an equitable fashion. To do that, we need to listen to communities affected by inequity and implement change accordingly by altering the way we evaluate and make investments in transportation. But we can't fix what we won't face. As a starting point for conversations underway at Caltrans, our department, we have expressed our commitment to achieving transportation equity as articulated in our statement of commitment. And that statement says, we will achieve equity when everyone has access to what they need to thrive, starting with our most vulnerable, no matter their race, socioeconomic status, identity, where they live, or how they travel. To create a brighter future for all Californians, Caltrans will implement concrete actions as outlined in our Race and Equity Action Plan. Regularly updated our action plan and establish clear metrics for accountability in order to achieve our commitments. At Caltrans, we recognize our leadership role and unique responsibility in a state of more than 39 million people that supports the fifth largest economy in the world. We strive to eliminate barriers and provide more equitable transportation for all in California. This understanding is the foundation for intentional decision-making that addresses past harms and endeavors to prevent future harms from our actions. We must work in collaboration with all of our stakeholders towards developing effective solutions, such as, number one, expanding public transportation to meet the needs of a diverse and aging population, including quality transit service in rural communities. Number two, developing and investing in passenger rail and transit projects that support inclusive high road job development opportunities in the trades, and specifically the clean transportation sector to address the disproportionate effects of pollution on minority and underserved communities. Number three, investing in safer multimodal and active transportation facilities on community highways, trails, and streets. enhancing maintenance and operations investments on all highways, and prioritizing underserved rural communities, including tribal governments. And finally, literally bridging the divides that highways have created. Paramount to an equitable transportation network is achieving structural integrity, not just in a physical sense, but metaphorically, within all transportation departments' identities. I would like to end with an inspirational quote from Nelson Mandela. Vision without action is just a dream. Action without vision just passes the time. And vision without action can change the world. We can and will change this world together. Thank you very much for having me today. I look forward to your questions and hearing from my fellow witnesses. Thank you very much.
Director, thank you very much for your testimony. We'll now hear from Director Davis.
Good morning, Chair Cardin, Ranking Member Kramer, and members of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Infrastructure. On behalf of Mayor Sylvester Turner, Houston Public Works Director Carol Haddock, and the 2.3 million residents of Houston, I really want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Veronica O. Davis, and I'm the Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations within the City of Houston's Public Works Department. I have oversight of over 16,000 lane miles, 3,500 miles of storm sewer, 3,600 miles of ditches, and 33 stormwater detention basins. I'm here in my official capacity as the City of Houston, but I also serve on the board of America Walks, and I'm the Houston representative to the National Association of City Transportation Officials. I will cite both in my testimony today. We're having this conversation because the end result of decades of inequitable decision-making are negative public health impacts such as asthma, obesity, serious injury, and fatalities that disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities with large populations of Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous people. For the purposes of this testimony, I will focus on serious injuries and fatalities. As cited earlier in Dangerous by Design, which examines pedestrian fatalities across the nation, it recognizes where pedestrians are disproportionately being hit. And in this committee that represents states that are at the top 20 most dangerous for pedestrians. Number 2, Alabama. 4, Mississippi. 7, Arizona. 8, South Carolina. 14, Oklahoma. 15, Arkansas. 16, California. 18, Maryland, and 19, Michigan. Texas is number 10, and unfortunately, the Houston region ranks the 18th most dangerous for pedestrians across the nation. And what does this have to do with equity? When you look at the data, as cited earlier, it disproportionately affects Black Americans and American Indians. In addition, when holding constant for population, we're seeing that the rates are comparable in rural areas. Equity is about everyone getting what they need. However, for my fellow transportation officials, we all know too well that the needs of our cities exceed the money, staff capacity, and time resources available to us. If you examine any major city, the findings will be almost identical. At the root is race-based segregation, compounded with decisions by planners, my fellow engineers, and elected officials to put highways and wide roads through minority and low-income communities. Houston, like many other cities, has the same story. In 2017, Mayor Sylvester Turner created Complete Communities Initiative, was to redirect current city and federal resources to communities that are under-resourced. The Complete Communities Initiative was established to be collaborative, impactful, and transformative. The present-day federal surface transportation policy continues to incentivize construction of high-speed, auto-centric roads at the expense of other modes. As a member of NACTO, I've worked with my colleagues to develop a list of priorities. Speaking to 4 today, the Reconnect Communities Act. Like many cities, Houston has numerous infrastructure barriers. In addition to highways built in the 1960s and 70s, Houston has 13 freight lines that merged near our downtown, 2 major freight rail yards on the north side of downtown, and more than 700 at-grade crossings. All pose safety risks to people walking and biking and require retrofit, and we ask for consideration when looking at the Reconnect Communities Act. Empowering cities to realize their vision. We with NACDO has been advocating for Congress for direct funding to cities to give us control over our state administrative projects within our borders. Create pedestrian priority set aside within the Surface Transportation Block Grant. The set aside should be explicitly for sidewalks, curb ramps, crosswalks, Americans with Disability Act transition plans, and roadway street narrowing. And lastly, incorporating funding for resiliency. Socially vulnerable residents within Houston face greater challenges recovering from extreme events. Incorporating resiliency can increase our project costs as much as 30%. As a keeper of the roadways in Houston, I have a responsibility to the public. Mayor Turner has called for a paradigm shift. This shift includes taking affirmative steps to right historical injustices by designing a multimodal transportation network that is inclusive of all people and needs. I recognize every decision today will impact the future generations. Thank you for your time and attention to this important topic. I look forward to hearing from my fellow witnesses, and I look forward to answering any questions that you all may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Director, for your testimony. We really appreciate it. We'll now go to Director Panos.
Well, Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Kramer, and members of the subcommittee, I'm Bill Panos, CEO of the North Dakota Department of Transportation. And at the outset, I want to express our department's appreciation for Senator Kramer's work on transportation issues. Let me also note that the transportation departments of Idaho, Montana, South Dakota, and Wyoming have authorized me to advise that they support my written testimony. Mr. Chairman, you're among the co-sponsors of Senate 1202, Chairman Carper's Reconnecting Communities Act. That legislation underscores that sometimes a transportation investment does not turn out well as was hoped when it was conceived and built. More specifically, a number of disadvantaged communities in large urban areas have found themselves divided by limited access highways. So today, we discuss what should be done going forward to address situations of disadvantaged communities that want better connections or to be reconnected. I'll begin with the rule setting. Upgrading a narrow two-lane road that connects to a tribal nation can make a difference. A modern two-lane road with standard width lanes and shoulders and a third lane at appropriate points for turns or passing is much safer. It also shortens the trip to a job, a school, or a healthcare provider. Making the same kind of improvement to another two-lane road can help a farmer move crops to a grain elevator more efficiently, which is important as farm operating margins are so thin. Rural roads are also used by buses, which are another tool to improve connections for disadvantaged individuals and families. In short, improved connections are needed by rural communities, including disadvantaged ones. State DOTs like mine help address these issues with highway and transit formula funding. Strong formula funding will enable the states to continue to address these situations and help people. Legislation should also make clear, if clarification is needed, that formula funds can be used for projects to address the divided urban community situations that are front and center at today's hearing. So eligibility and strong formula funding will enhance the ability of states to address these urban connectivity issues quickly. Regional issues should also be considered. If an interstate system highway through a city is proposed to be effectively severed, will there be consideration of whether that leads to backups on the city's beltway or bypass highway? Will that mean increased air pollution elsewhere? Consideration of those factors could lead to win-win solutions. For example, a decision could be made to cap rather than remove an interstate system segment that would enable walkable and drivable community connections above the highway without a break in the interstate system. Before closing, I'll comment on funding. I've already mentioned that strong formula funding and flexible program eligibilities enable a state to connect or reconnect disadvantaged communities in rural and urban areas. But formula funds do more than that. They help improve roads, bridges, bike paths, sidewalks. They pay for safety investments. They can also be transferred to transit projects. Formula funds are delivered as projects quickly. Discretionary programs, however, can't be deployed until after program rules are established, applications sought, applications prepared and filed, applications reviewed by USDOT, and a decision made on awards and a grant contract finalized. As formula funds are so beneficial, it is not surprising that state DOTs have broadly advocated that 90% or more of highway program funds be distributed by formula. 90% itself is down from an estimated 92% of FAST Act highway funds being distributed by formula. So it is noteworthy that Senate 1202 would provide $15 billion over 5 years for a non-formula program to fund reconnection projects. $15 billion in discretionary funds is so large that to maintain a highway program distribution with 90% formula funds, one would have to pair these discretionary funds with an additional $135 billion in formula funds. So the overall funding approach should not de-emphasize formula funding. Lastly, but importantly, as described in my written testimony, we support a range of actions that can help advance equity for the disadvantaged and disadvantaged communities. That concludes my statement. I'll be pleased to respond to questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Director, thank you very much for your testimony. Now we'll now go to Dr. Paulson.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on this important topic with you today. Equity in transportation has been an issue for decades, and it's certainly getting increasing attention now. The COVID situation, for example, has increased the sensitivity to disadvantaged communities and groups. In my written testimony, I used the comparison of the fantasy of teleportation as a point of contrast to actual modes where there is no such thing as perfect equity. The incidence and consequences of modes differ across geography and market segments. Historically, we've looked at equity with respect to a number of characteristics, certainly access to modes and accessibility via those modes. We've looked at the incidence of consequences of those modes based on the services and facilities, and we've looked at the equity issues as it relates to the collection and distribution of funds. Common topics that arise in those discussions are things like, are heavy trucks paying their fair share of roadway costs? Are rural or urban areas getting the appropriate attention in the formulas, etc.? More recently, equity sensitivities have been broadened from that. We're looking, for example, at things like whether or not ride-hailing and e-scooter services are being distributed equitably. And we now have the capability to look at things like access to health care and fresh foods as influenced by our transportation system. We have discovered, certainly from the academic perspective, that defining and measuring equity is extremely difficult. Some people think equity means that the government should spend the same amount on transit as roadways, while others think that equity means folks that contribute user fees should have those user fees spent on projects that benefit them. Some people think it's inequitable to burden future generations with debt for spending on operations for services today versus leaving those folks with an asset that pays dividends in the future. Beyond defining equity, we're seeking to understand the extent to which efforts to improve equity can be leveraged in terms of improving overall societal inequities. And that's not a trivial challenge at all in terms of understanding the merits and value of investing in this type of solution to improve equity. Equity is not easily accomplished and is challenging. Another key point that I pointed out in my written testimony is that geography is a critical factor as it relates to equity. And it's important to recognize that urban areas with roadway systems typically have a hub and spoke type of configuration. And the geometry of that means that the transportation network is more dense and typically higher capacity as you approach the core or the hub of that urban area. Accordingly, there's more impacts as well as more accessibility for those areas in general because of the presence of those facilities. So populations that tend to congregate in the urban, interurban areas are disproportionately impacted by the consequence of those systems, but also have the benefit of greater accessibility both on the roadway side and on the public transportation side. When we think about and when I think about transportation equity, both as a researcher and a practitioner, a number of issues I think are important to consider as we deliberate how to address improving transportation equity. First of all, I think it's critical to realize that the transportation community, the full community from planning to decision making, have become much more sensitive to these issues. And in fact, our tactics and strategies are much more robust than was the case at the beginning of the interstate era. Even simple things like our outreach and planning processes are more engaging than historically was the case. Simple things like virtual communications that we've excelled at during COVID. People are realizing that this is a nice venue to have more inclusiveness in our planning processes, for example. But it goes beyond that. We've done more with engineering and planning. We're using our facilities more creatively. We're mitigating the size of the footprints. We're ensuring better connectivity for people and even for wildlife across facilities. We're using excess parcels to make contributions to the community, etc. It's also important, and it's come up in some of the comments earlier, that the interstate system was really intended as a national system to provide connectivity. It was created with the intention of addressing everything from military preparedness, economic competitiveness, mitigation in catastrophes, etc. And its constituents and stakeholders reflect that full breadth of intended uses. So anything that's done that influences that system going forward really needs to have a stakeholder set that reflects that full breadth of audience in those decision-making things. While it certainly impacts local communities, the benefits go well beyond that. And it's important to realize that urban communities weren't the only ones negatively impacted by the freeway. There's dozens of small towns and communities across the country that were bypassed by freeways that had dramatic impacts on their economy because of that. So when we think about mitigating consequences, we need to recognize that those consequences didn't just occur in urban communities. When we think about economics and spending on transportation, it's important to realize that oftentimes in discussions we talk about the multiplier benefits that we're going to see from transportation investment. Historically, the economists have calculated those benefits based on the enhanced mobility that those investments provide. We need to be careful as we expand the purpose of those investments to make sure that we are in fact getting benefits from those investments that merit their expenditure going forward. We need to be careful that the higher costs don't mitigate the return on that investment. We should also be careful in presuming how social and commercial interactions will occur should we fix or change some of the urban infrastructure conditions. Today's social networks and commercial networks are very different than those that existed in the 50s. A lot of the socialization and economic activity aren't place-based. They're based on social connections and interactions, media connections. They're formed around jobs and schools and workplaces, much more so than social places or local residential places. So we need to be careful about presuming that we're going to return things to a 1960 concept of what a neighborhood and interactions in the community are.
Dr. Paulson asked if you could summarize your statement.
I can. Looking ahead, I think it's important that all the local, state, and regional perspectives are brought to bear when we make these decisions. The stakeholders for these investments oftentimes, particularly for interstate-centric investments, go well beyond the local area. So it's important that these folks all have a place at the table as we make those decisions. A number of communities have and are in the process of exploring some of these issues as we speak, and they've developed pretty good capabilities to do that. We can go back and look at things like the Big Dig in Boston, for example. Communities have found ways to mitigate consequences and work around these things through existing processes, and I think there's opportunities with adequate resources to continue to do that in the future, leveraging the capabilities and the processes that have been developed at the local and state levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paulson. All of you have raised issues that I know we wanted to get into a discussion during the questioning by members of the Senate. I'm going to yield my time to Senator Padilla, whose director is here from California. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Senator Cardin, and good morning, everybody. Before I get to my question, I wanted to acknowledge an important topic that this committee has discussed and continues to deliberate. We know that renewing our infrastructure fosters economic growth to connect communities and improve quality of life for all Americans. But all too often in the past, policymakers have ignored the needs of the people most directly impacted by these projects and have failed to serve vulnerable communities. Even worse, infrastructure has at times contributed to the destruction of communities, especially low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. Ensuring equitable investment in all communities is an essential aspect of building back better and addressing our nation's infrastructure needs. In California, leaders like Director Omishakin are at the forefront of this effort by recognizing the communities of color and underserved communities have experienced fewer benefits and a greater share of the negative impacts associated with our transportation system, as well as by issuing a race and equity action plan and making tangible commitments, including creating a workforce at all levels that is representative of the communities that it serves, meaningfully engaging communities most impacted by structural racism in the creation and implementation of the programs and projects that impact their daily lives, increasing pathways to opportunity for minority-owned and disadvantaged business enterprises, and combating the climate crisis and its disproportionate impact on frontline and vulnerable communities. So I look forward to working with my colleagues to amplify these commitments at the federal level to create a more equitable transportation system for all Americans. Again, in prior hearings, we talked about the physical impact of too many infrastructure projects, particularly transportation projects, on communities. Today, I want to focus on business opportunities. As we work to pass a bold package to invest in our nation's infrastructure, we must ensure that such funding also helps businesses, especially small, minority-owned, and women-owned businesses that have been hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, to rebuild and to thrive. Current regulations require that agencies receiving federal transportation funding use a portion of such funds to support disadvantaged business enterprises. Unfortunately, current regulations can unintentionally create incentives to keep small businesses small, rather than helping them mature into medium-sized businesses or prime contractors. In response to these concerns, agencies like LA Metro have established innovative local programs to support small businesses with the tools to get certified and to grow. These tools include creating a medium business size standard and provide a pathway for small businesses to bid on and win contracts as prime contractors. As Congress seeks to overhaul our nation's infrastructure, I believe that we can scale up these innovative policies to help firms that participate in disadvantaged business enterprise programs grow and prosper. That's why I'm working on legislation to incorporate these tools into the requirements for federal transportation programs and to provide startup capital that will help communities most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I understand that Caltrans supports efforts to raise the cap on the size of transportation sector businesses eligible for disadvantaged business enterprise programs. And so, Director Omishakin, can you discuss how reforms like raising the cap and scaling up innovative local programs are critical to addressing the effects of past and present discrimination and helping disadvantaged business enterprises grow?
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Thanks a lot for your statement and your question there, and thank you for your tenured leadership for our state, and now as our U.S. Senator as well. Thank you very much. Small businesses, we know, are the life engine, the lifeblood of the economy of this country. When we talk about recovering from the impacts of the pandemic, there's no doubt that part of where we need to pay the most attention to is the small businesses that exist in all of our states across the country. Today, the cap on the DBE program, the National DBE program, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program, is roughly $26 million. I think it's $26.29 million. We believe, and I think in reference to your question, Senator, we believe that if that ceiling is increased, if you increase that ceiling from 26 million roughly to possibly 39 million, which is not an arbitrary number, it is the number that the Small Business Administration uses, the SBA. If you bump that ceiling up from 26 million to 39 million to allow businesses to stay in longer in the DBE program, we believe those businesses will become more competitive and have a longer opportunity to stay within the program and continue to do good work and flourish. Today in California, I'll tell you that our program is roughly, our entire small business program is $1.1 billion annually. Our plan is to try to grow that in this next year to roughly 1.2 billion. So at least another 100 million coming into small business in our department here at Caltrans. So we think this is an important step, and thank you for your leadership again, Senator, as you push for something like this.
Thank you very much.
Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again, and Director Panos, thanks again for being here and representing the rural perspective on a topic that's usually associated, obviously, with larger urban areas. And your testimony highlighted rural disadvantaged communities are often simply looking to get connected in the first place, as opposed to the many urban examples that are looking to reconnect. I'm going to ask you, first of all, to explain briefly that distinction, why it's important in rural areas like North Dakota, but at the same time, ask you to comment specifically on the Reconnecting Communities Act as is being discussed today as a potential solution to some of these inequities. And based on the parameters within the bill that I know you've read and from your time in North Dakota and Wyoming, can you think of any examples of projects that would have qualified for the construction grants as designed in this bill?
Chairman Cardin, Senator Kramer, thank you so much for the question and, by the way, for this opportunity. You know, in states like North Dakota, the connection to school and healthcare or job is unlikely to be, traversed by a short bus ride or walking. What many in metro areas would call long distances are frequently involved in day-to-day travel here in rural states. And improved and safer roads can mean a connection to a job or other essentials in a more reasonable, or at least a less unreasonable time frame. Improved roads help farmers get our crops to the grain elevators, more efficiently and safely. And to answer the second part of your question, based on my reading of the Reconnecting Community Act, I can't recall any projects in either Wyoming or North Dakota that would qualify for it in its current form. Although applicability may be unlikely, a close review of the specific facts, I think, will be appropriate at a time when the grant program's put together. I would say that it's basically, as currently written, and some of our concerns are not geared to address rural circumstances, but more urban circumstances. But I think we pointed out both in our written testimony and oral testimony ways that we can improve it so that we can take full advantage across the country in all states for this important work. And so it's really, I think it's really a significant point to say that, and to not lose this point, that poor planning decisions have led to adverse circumstances for specific communities. And that includes rural communities and rural states. For us, it's about reconnecting these communities and in some cases connecting them so that they can participate in a normal daily life and a normal daily economy. And it's particularly true when we talk about the link between transportation and our agricultural economy, our energy economy, and our tourism economy here in North Dakota. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very helpful. I might drill down a little bit, both with you, Director Panos and Omashakin, since you both have experience in very different states, but similar experiences. And one of you, and maybe it was you, Bill, who testified to what the formula would look like if we were to apply the $15 billion and to the formula. So if Congress distributed the $15 billion via the existing formula programs, it would equate to about $95 million for North Dakota and $1.4 billion for California over 5 years. That's if we were going to, just do it per formula. So for planning and budgetary certainty, would you prefer, and I'd ask Director Omashakin first and then Director Panos, would you prefer guaranteed and increased funding, or would you rather want to gamble with the application process for a DOT grant?
Did you, Senator Kramer?
No spin there, sir. No.
Senator Kramer, it sounds like you used the word gamble. So for us, the tradition for state DOTs has long been the use of the formula program. It's a part of our history to understand, just like you said, Senator, in this particular case, we would get roughly $1.5 billion. But we're also, we don't mind taking advantage of a competitive grant program. We have been successful in the past in programs like the Tiger program or Infra program, the various programs that have come out of USDOT. The state of California has been very competitive in those programs to be able to still bring money into the state. So we will be prepared either way, whether it be a formula type of program where we would be guaranteed over $1 billion, or a grant program. We believe in California we will be competitive either way. Thank you for that, Senator Kramer.
Yeah, as my time has run out, maybe Bill, I'll restate the question a little different. How has North Dakota fared under the Infra grant program that was part of the FAST Act?
We've never received an Infra grant. We're one of the very few states that has not, and so I think that we definitely prefer badly needed formula funding in rural states across the country due to our population size and our participation in this amazing interstate highway system that we have in our country. And so we think that states can deliver it more quickly than a discretionary grant program, and it can be moved for a variety of needs throughout the country that relate to the topic of today's hearing, which is an important topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with much that has been said this morning about the historic underinvestment in communities of color and low-income areas across the United States, both urban and rural. Step one is recognizing transportation inequities. Step two is investing in infrastructure that helps bring communities together rather than keeping them apart. So it is important that we're engaging on that first step today. And I thank the chairman for calling this hearing. I hope the committee's surface transportation bill does reflect today's discussions. Director Omishakin, I want to discuss another area of historic underinvestment, accessibility for individuals with disabilities. As you know, much of our transportation infrastructure built before the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 is still in operation and still inaccessible to individuals with physical, sensory, intellectual, and developmental disabilities. Do you agree with me that overcoming accessibility inequities requires targeted investment and commitment by transportation officials to address these challenges sooner than later? Director Omishakin?
Oh, yes, here we go. I was on double mute here. Sorry about that, Senator. Senator Duckworth, thank you for the question, and thank you for your leadership in championing issues like this since you've been in office. As you mentioned, we're celebrating just over 30 years of the passing of the ADA. And one of the main implementers of the ADA has been both city and state departments of transportation. There's no doubt that in California, we are committed to this, and we believe that targeted investment should continue. Our governor, Governor Newsom, has set his umbrella for his leadership for the state as a California for all, meaning all people, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of ability, regardless of income. And so across different spectrums in the work that we do in state government in California, we absolutely believe that this continues to need to be a focus. ADA needs to be a focus, and targeted investment is a big part of how we will continue to see the difference and change that we want to see.
Thank you. Does anybody on the panel disagree with me that addressing infrastructure accessibility should be a priority? Okay, thank you. Next week, I plan to introduce my All Station Accessibility Program Act to help target accessibility opportunities across legacy transit and commuter rail systems. I'll give you an example. In Chicago, our L and our CTA is very proud that they plan on being completely wheelchair accessible in 20 years. And when they told me this, and they were very proud, and I applaud their efforts, what I said to them was, so a half century, 50 years, a half century after the ADA is when persons with disabilities will finally have full access. And that simply is not enough, which is why I wrote the All Stations Accessibility Program Act. In areas across the nation, significant transportation accessibility challenges remain. This is unacceptable, and we must do more to address this problem. Director Omishakin, departments of transportation often view project planning, financing, and implementation in modal silos that can inhibit delivery and limit connectivity across the system. Would you agree with me that Congress should be looking at ways to remove outdated modal barriers in order to expedite project delivery and to save taxpayer dollars?
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. I believe so. I think truly the way that we're going to create a robust transportation system and enhance where we are today is to absolutely connect all the modes as much as we possibly can. The current leadership at USDOT, I believe, has made statements around this. Secretary Buttigieg, I believe, has made comments around being a one DOT, essentially meaning that all the different branches, whether it be FTA, FHWA, FRA, all need to be thinking about how to work together to achieve the goals for a great transportation system. And we're definitely doing that in California. As I lead this department, this is something that we talk about every single day, is how we can become more multimodal and more connected. And I think the same thing applies for the rest of us in the nation as well.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear you say that. Next week, I am reintroducing my bipartisan TIFIA for Airports Act with Senator Cornyn. So it is bipartisan. to extend the underused TIFIA loan program to major airport projects like those at O'Hare, LAX, Dallas, Fort Worth. Thank you all for being on the panel today. I yield back while I'm out of time.
Thank you,
Thank
Senator
you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Loomis?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. And I want to say hello to Bill Panos, one of our witnesses who is with the great state of North Dakota now and formerly the great state of Wyoming. So wonderful to have you on this panel. And Bill, I have a question for you. Could you talk just a little more about why formula funding is so important to rural states like ours?
Senator Lummis and Chairman Cardin. Senator Lummis, it's great to see you and in this format, and thank you for the question. Formula funding is important to all states and certainly important to rural states like North Dakota and Wyoming for a number of different reasons. It can be used in more communities for more kinds of investments. It can be including projects that improve or add capacity. Plus, you can be confident that you have formula funds. We can plan longer periods of time in our states with the USDOT for those investments and with our private sector community as well. Our experience in North Dakota, as indicated in my previous response, is that you can never truly count on obtaining funds from a competitive grant program, but you certainly can from the formula program, which is why I think it was designed in its inception. I would also suggest that we can use formula funds for a variety of different programs. And I know that the chairman had mentioned in his opening comments the TAP program, which we have taken advantage of. Thank you, Chairman. We have taken advantage of throughout our state, and many rural states have, to improve our cities and walkability and connected systems and multimodal approaches to transportation in rural states. And so formula funds are helpful for a variety of different things, including multimodal, including bike and pedestrian safety, including increasing capacity, connecting communities, reconnecting communities. We use formula in cooperation with our tribal nations when we can, and have expanded our use of that. So for ADA programs, et cetera. So I think that the formula offers choice and flexibility that we would not have with a discretionary focused program.
Well, thank you. And what kinds of equity issues are different for rural states versus urban areas, especially like our states of North Dakota and Wyoming, which incidentally are the two states that lead the nation in terms of per capita contributions to the highway fund?
So, Chairman Cardin, Senator Lummis, our states are oftentimes looking to connect our communities and connect them in a way which is sustainable and resilient. Although we don't have the kind of flooding that you see on coastlines or near oceans like Houston and maybe in my native state of California, we do have flooding, and we have lots of flooding in North Dakota, and it's significant. And I think that connecting these communities in a resilient way so that they can access their community in flood season, that they can access their communities during severe storms, that kind of thing, is really very critical. A lot of it is just basic connective roads and bridges in these communities, and basic transportation that is significantly different than the urban connections that a lot of the focus has been in the hearing today. Not to say that either are more important or less important. It's all very important. It's just different. Yeah. And of course, this committee has been great at understanding the differences among the 50 states And along with my colleagues in California and colleagues around the country, we've been, I think, really focused on the differences across the country.
Well, thank you so much. And again, it's so great to see you. My next question is for Mr. Paulson. Dr. Paulson, it's my understanding that the current formula programs have the guardrails in place already to solve the sorts of equity issues that are being discussed here today. Do you feel that the current formula programs can fully capture these issues in the planning phases?
I think they can, and I think they have, and they have increasingly over time. I think there's been a recognition of some of these issues, and as folks have pointed out in looking at examples across the country, from Houston to Baltimore to New York, et cetera, communities are addressing and dealing with these issues already. I personally think that the best decisions are made when the decision makers are faced with the full spectrum of choices and the full spectrum of discretionary opportunities. Then they involve all of the stakeholders and make the best decisions. I think to the extent that we constrain or parameterize those decisions, just as we alluded to the fact that we've tended to do that at the federal level with modal silos, I think that results in some suboptimal decision making. So yes, I'm very comfortable with giving those resources to the folks that are in the best position to discern the best decisions for their communities and for the stakeholders in those projects at the local, regional, and state levels.
Thank you very much. Thanks, witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Loomis. We now go to the chairman of the full committee, Senator Carper, who is with us.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and my thanks to you and to our ranking member of our subcommittee for holding. We always say this is an important hearing. This is an important hearing, and it's one that both our chair and I think a number of others on this committee are especially interested in and mindful of it. I want to thank Senator Cardin, Senator Padilla, and others who joined us, Chris Van Hall and I, on legislation that's being discussed here to some extent today. So thanks for having this hearing, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Before I turn for my first question to Mr. O. Mashakin and Ms. Davis, let me take a moment to explain why this discussion is of particular interest to me and some of the folks in my home state. As you know, colleagues, the development of our national highway system was meant to bring communities together and to connect neighborhoods to opportunity and also to connect them to prosperity. But sadly, we know that too often it hasn't turned out that way for a number of Americans. Communities of color, rural communities, disadvantaged communities were oftentimes harmed by this infrastructure development. Pockets of the country were left behind, cut off from transportation access. Highways were built in ways that divided communities instead of bringing them together. The legislation that Senator Cardin, Senator Padilla, Senator Van Hollen, and I and others recently introduced, it's called the Reconnecting Communities Act. And our legislation seeks to correct some of the injustices that I've just mentioned. Our bill would connect and revitalize areas that have been harmed by the development of our national highway system. And we look forward to working with our colleagues on this legislation so that we might right some of the wrongs of our past and unite our communities for a brighter future together. So with that, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, I'd like to turn to some questions for maybe by the end of the hearing, I can pronounce Mr. Omishakin without hesitating. And my last question will be asking him to tell us about where his name comes from. We have a lot of interesting names, but that's near the top of the list, Mr. Omishakin. But here we go. We heard this is also, I think, for Ms. Davis, or Mr. Davis, rather. We heard a lot about the challenges faced by both the urban and rural areas. The challenges for both environmentalists are undeniable, and for both environments are undeniable. We've done a lot of work to provide set-asides for rural areas in our current transportation programs, and that includes set-asides and special rules for rural areas in the Infra grant program, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, the Bill grant program, which used to be called Tiger, and the TIFIA program. So here's my question. Why do you think that we have made special rules and set-asides to meet the needs of rural areas, but have not taken the same approach for addressing the critical and unique needs of urban areas? And do you agree it would be appropriate to do so? That's a question for both of you. Thank you. Ms. Davis, Mr. Omashakin. Ms. Davis, why don't you go first?
Okay.
Hello?
Ms. Veronica. She may be on a call. I know she's most of us are in the office.
Okay, Mr. Omashakin, would you like to lead off? Thank you.
Yeah, let me give it a quick shot, Senator. But first, thank you for your leadership on the committee. I've had a chance to see you at ASHTO, the annual meeting, a few times.
How are you doing?
Very well, very well,
Nice
and really appreciate it. And by the way, the name is Nigerian, and you do an excellent job pronouncing it, actually.
Thank you.
So to your question, I believe
I
that
practiced all last night, so just in case you want.
to your question, I believe we should, as a nation, and I think we're doing that more and more, trying to get closer to the issues that we have in common, and not spend a lot of our energy talking about the things that make us so different. And the same applies for transportation. Director Panos from North Dakota just talked about very eloquently the challenges that rural states face as it relates to climate change issues as well. The fact that they see flooding and they sometimes may see fires. Those are issues that plague a large urban state like California. Well, urban in the sense that many urban areas. There are a lot of rural areas in California as well. I think we can make targeted investments that help both urban states and urban cities, and rural states and with rural cities as well. So I think those things that unify us, that connect us, is where a majority of our attention should be paid moving forward. I don't know if Ms. Davis got a chance. She may have had to run. I don't see her on anymore, but Senator, hopefully that answers your question just a little bit. I think targeted investment in both.
All right, thank you, sir. Good to see you. I think it looks like it says we have lost Miss Davis. Well, I hope we can find her again. Bring her in. My time's expired. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I want to explore the issue of local input a little bit more. I think there's general consensus here that in the equity issues we have challenges of communities that have been divided or isolated as a result of transportation programs. We have consensus that the formula of funding programs is critically important in that it gives predictable flow of federal support for transportation programs in our states, that we want to get as much local input as we possibly can. So let me just start with one of the examples that I mentioned in my opening statement, which was the Gwynns Falls Greenway in Baltimore. Mr. Olmsted, who originally designed Baltimore, connected all communities through green space, but over time, obviously, that got built over by housing and by roads, and communities got isolated. So when I was a member of the House of Representatives, I sought to get federal support to reconnect the communities along the Gwynns Falls that are mostly minority communities and isolated communities through a pedestrian bike path. But it was a hard time to do it through the formula funding. So at that time, we had congressional earmarks, and I was able to use an earmark in order to get the communities connected. And it was hailed as one of the major equity issues in our community of reconnecting communities. As a result of that experience, I worked with then our former colleague, Senator Cochran, to develop the transportation alternative programs that have been mentioned here, to give local communities more input on how monies can be spent in order to deal with equity issues in the community. And I think most now recognize that as a valuable program. I've heard several of the witnesses talk about the TAP program, and I appreciate that. But one of the challenges is that these programs are very much controlled by the states, even though they are local for the local communities. And the question is, how much more can we give control to local communities in order to deal with the equity issues, such as programs like the TAP program? Now, I'm sorry Ms. Davis is no longer, I think, on the call, because she could give us a perspective from Houston and Nashville, where she had responsibility. But I would appreciate any of our panelists who are willing to tell us how we can improve local input in regards to funds that go through the state formulas to deal with equity issues.
Let me comment briefly on that, if I may. And I think it's important when you think of addressing local priorities and local issues that you really look at the full spectrum of resources that might be available to address those. And those can include local and regional resources, as well as state and potentially federal resources. There's certainly a constituency that says federal funding is so modest that it needs to be focused on things that are of critical interest at the national level, and that state and or local resources should be targeted towards more local priorities and initiatives that might vary fairly dramatically across the country. Now, having said that and recognizing the importance of federal dollars, even at the local level, there are other opportunities, for example, through some of the discretionary programs to leverage federal resources to accomplish those things like Infra and Tiger-type programs as well. And there are certainly opportunities through reauthorization to identify the critical priorities that will help guide the overall programs as well. So there are a number of opportunities to do those. Oftentimes people naturally look for somebody else to pay for their priorities, but we need to, again, at the local level, look at the full spectrum of opportunities, including local resources. And you might note that, you know, more than half of states have increased their funding for transportation over the past few years. Numerous areas have been successful with referendums, and they are at the discretion to direct those resources to local priorities.
Mr. Panis, let me direct this to you. You've been very effective in saying the states, the formula programs are very important. They determine priorities. How can we get greater local input in regards particularly to the TAP program, but so that local communities, and you've mentioned this during your testimony, have more input as to how the transportation decisions are made in your state?
Chairman Cardin, thank you for the question. You know, I think that even through the formula, the emphasis on expanding local engagement would be helpful not only in larger states, but smaller states like North Dakota. That is to say, we have great programs now through our incredible partners at the USDOT, through our STIP planning program, which is our State Transportation Improvement Plan, through a variety of other plans on deploying the formula funds. We've got a good start. The interesting part of the question is that there is a huge difference between local government, let's say in a larger state than in a smaller state. Here, some of our largest cities are 60,000 people. That's it, and they go down from there. And so those we're engaged with on a regular basis. In fact, we have 3 MPOs in North Dakota, which is not common in Northern Plains states, but very common in some of our larger states. But the rest of the communities are so small as to require full engagement by the state DOT with them. We have another classification of local government called townships here in North Dakota, which are extremely small and under 100 people in some cases. And in fact, our legislature this year had passed some regulations and funding to allow the state DOT to work better with them. This also, I would mention, includes our tribal nations. We have great partnerships and agreements with our tribal nations throughout our state. And these oftentimes underserved communities need more help from the state. So I think we are positioned, state DOTs are positioned in rural states to engage even more through the formula funding with our local communities and moving these programs forward. I hope that helps a little bit with the answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll go now to Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address this first question to Mr. Panos. And I'd like to discuss the condition of roads on tribal lands. Like North Dakota, Arizona is home to large swaths of tribal lands that contain thousands of miles of roads administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it also administered by tribal governments. And nearly two-thirds of these roads are unpaved dirt or gravel roads. And frankly, many of them are unsafe. School buses transporting Native kids need constant repairs at a much higher rate than school buses that travel on paved roads. And the CDC estimates that Native Americans using these roads suffer crashes and pedestrian collisions up to 3 times higher than non-natives. Mr. Panos, how would you describe the road system on tribal lands and their impact on the daily lives of Native Americans?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kelly, thank you. Thank you so much for your question. As you know, like Arizona, the Northern Plains states have numerous sort of areas of tribal nations. In all of the 5 states that my written testimony was coordinated with, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Idaho, have significant areas like many of the states in the West where there are tribal nations. And we, as I described earlier, work extensively with them and are seeking even more coordinated support for them with BIA, with authorities given to us by the state, with authorities given to us by the USDOT through the formula, with authorities given to us through BIA to work with them more and more. And on many of these tribal nation areas, the little things matter. If we can bring gravel in to help re-gravel a road, or we can improve with a stop sign or other kinds of things, they make a world of difference to these areas and improve safety significantly. So a little bit of money goes a long way. And again, I would focus back on the formula, creating more authorities within the formula to allow us to do these kinds of things that are necessary with local government, with tribal nations, I think would help and provide that kind of support across our country. And so I hope that answers your question. And that's been my experience here in North Dakota, Wyoming, and I'm sure is the experience in Arizona as well. And I must say one more thing: the DOTs are doing a great job at reaching out and engaging the BIA, engaging tribal nations every single day on public transit, on roads, on bridges, on resiliency, those kinds of things. But more can be done.
As I've spent time on the Navajo Nation, a number of times when I've visited, this issue has come up. It comes up frequently, and it affects not only the condition. There are other effects here. As an example, I would give it affects the ability for Native schools to get teachers. When you have to travel a long distance on a dirt road, it's not a practical thing or a desirable thing for teachers that are commuting to tribal schools. So, Mr. Panos, would you agree that funding high-priority tribal projects has benefits for non-natives as well?
Senator Kelly, Chairman Card, yes. I'm glad you brought up the example of schools. For about 5 years, I was the school construction executive for the state of Washington, and built about 500 schools a year for about 5 years there, K-12 schools throughout the state, including all the tribal nation schools. And so based on that experience, I would say yes to your question.
Well, thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Whitehouse. We understand Senator Whitehouse had to get off the video line. Senator Kramer, anything further?
I don't think so, Mr. Chairman, other than thank you for this, and thanks to all of the witnesses. They've really been excellent, and I've appreciated it. I think it's very helpful.
Well, I concur in Senator Kramer's comments about our witnesses. I think this hearing has been extremely helpful, and I'm certain that there's going to be some follow-up information that you all can help us with as we start to craft legislation. I know that Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito are in open, active in negotiations where Senator Kramer and I are engaged in that also. And I think your testimony today has really helped us in regards to this. I understand that Senator Sullivan may be en route, and as a respect to him, I will hold the hearing open for a few minutes. If you all could be a little bit patient, and we'll see whether Senator Sullivan perhaps I'll ask one additional question at this point, and we'll see whether Senator Sullivan arrives. And that is in regards to the safety issues. We've talked a little bit about that, but we do know that the number of pedestrian and bicycle accidents have increased pretty dramatically. We know that there is a more vulnerability in minority communities to these types of safety issues. Is there anything specific that we can do in a reauthorization bill to help deal with pedestrian and bike safety that doesn't infringe upon the basic structure of the program and formative funding that would be helpful as you deal with these issues? Mr. Mashkin, maybe I'll start with you this time.
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. Hopefully, you can still hear me well.
We can.
Okay, good. So this issue in particular is probably one of the most important that is plaguing our sector today, and I can't state more clearly how important this issue is. As a nation today, we're losing nearly 37,000 people using our transportation system. In California, we represent 10% of those fatality numbers. Roughly 3,600 people, 3,700 people die on the transportation system every single year. That's 10 a day in our state, 10 a day. Nearly 3 of those 10, nearly 3 of them are people who are walking and biking and trying to get access to transit. We believe that additional funding for safety, not just at NHTSA. NHTSA is an important part of this because of the behavioral part of it, but also at DOT and at federal highways. Additional investment there will be big. And from a policy standpoint, one of the things that we've been talking about more and more is a safe systems approach to addressing the safety challenges that we face on our transportation system. So not just thinking about one particular part of the challenge, but thinking about every single segment of the transportation system and how it fits in together to try to address the issues that are coming up. So additional funding, no doubt, making some adjustments from a policy standpoint to be more supportive of safety and keeping this issue absolutely on the front burner. I believe very much in everything that we just discussed on equity. And if you look at the equity implications of this as well, the people in minority communities are taking a heavier hit here as well. So this is a very important issue, and really appreciate you, Senator Chairman, for raising this question about what we can do more in the safety space.
Well, thank you for that reply. As we look at the reauthorization bill, we might be asking for specific guidance as to how we can, if we direct funds, how is the most flexible way to allow you to deal with the local challenges that you have, but still focused on the reality that we need to reduce the vulnerability of pedestrians and bicyclists for injury. It's a huge problem in my state of Maryland. I think in every state we have seeing escalating numbers of pedestrian and bicycle accidents. So thank you for that input, and we'll be back to you as to how perhaps we can be helpful in the reauthorization bill. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And You know, one issue, and I'm just going to put this up there for all the nominees, is the issue when there's a discussion on racial disparity and infrastructure. One thing that happens too often in my state is that you have certain groups, outside groups, some of the more extreme environmental groups that want to shut down economic opportunity in places like Alaska. No roads, no resource development, no opportunity to access federal lands. And that's kind of a common theme, but the groups that impacts, at least in Alaska, are oftentimes the indigenous communities. So there's a big push, for example, right now the Biden administration, big push to delay any resource development projects in my state. That really impacts the indigenous populations. So that element of racial disparity on infrastructure, in my view at least, in my state, often gets overlooked. So I've been raising this with the administration, saying if we're going to address some of these transportation and infrastructure challenges from an equity standpoint, don't forget the people whose economic livelihoods get shut down when certain outside groups from my state's perspective come in and say, no, we don't want any roads in Alaska. We don't want any access to resources. We don't want any oil and gas development. The people that are often hurt are the people that the whole point of racial equity is supposedly meant to serve. So I'd like a comment from our witnesses on that, because I think sometimes these issues can be viewed in an urban-rural perspective, but in my state, they're often very much issues that some of the more extreme environmental groups try to impose on Alaskans have the biggest and most negative impact on the indigenous populations, and has a real negative impact there. So I'd welcome a comment or suggestion from any of the witnesses on that issue, because it doesn't come up enough, and at least in my state, it seems to be forgotten.
I'll be glad to make a brief comment with respect to that. The issue historically, mobility has been perceived as a contributor to quality of life and economic opportunity. It's access to jobs, worship, health care, et cetera. And a lot of our investment in transportation has been to stimulate that, to improve the economic opportunity and quality of life. To the extent that initiatives, whatever they are, be it environmental motives, energy motives, or mitigating externalities of transportation, to the extent that they offset some of the mobility opportunities, they will have other consequences, including consequences on the economy and quality of life of folks. And so I think it's very important in that context that the full set of issues and factors are really at the table, and addressing the safety issue before. There's another classic example of that. If we don't provide adequate transportation capacity in our premium systems, and that demand spills over onto local streets, it increases the chances of safety risk quite dramatically. So we need to recognize those trade-offs and deal with them and address those in our decision making, because mobility does provide economic opportunity. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? I'll just give you another example. Again, Alaska is quite unique, but we have over 200 communities, 200 that are not connected by roads. And yet when you try to build a road anywhere in my state, you'll get 20 lower 48 environmental groups to stop the building of a road. It's really frustrating for us in Alaska. Any other thoughts on these issues of access and communities of color? I mean, these are the indigenous people in my state, which is a great group of Americans who often get left out in some of these discussions.
Senator, I'll briefly say the Toksoma Shocking from California. That in our state, we have the largest tribal nation population in the country. There are more than, I think it's 109 federally recognized tribal governments in California. That's nearly 1 million people with that background in our state. I think what we try to focus on and what we're going to try to focus on moving forward when we talk about equity is truly listening to those communities, those nations, those governments, to see what their needs are. It's true that sometimes building a road will have, just like we've talked about very well this morning already, that sometimes building a road can have significant negative impacts on a community that we sometimes overlook. But if a community truly needs a road and they need that access for their livelihood and for their upward mobility moving forward, I think it's our responsibility as a DOT, as a State Department of Transportation or City Department of Transportation, to engage them and listen to them and figure out how to create that better access for them, if that's truly what's needed. But we need to be careful nonetheless and use the environmental process that we have, NEPA, use those existing processes to make sure that if we're building it, it's not going to mean increased challenges from a climate standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from a public health standpoint. We have to keep those things on the front burner as well. But no doubt we have to listen to communities and let that guide our decision making as we make transportation investments moving forward.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Let me again join with Senator Kramer in thanking our witnesses. I think this has been a very helpful hearing to the mission of our subcommittee and full committee. And with that, the subcommittee will stand adjourned. Again, thanks to our witnesses.